What if he had chosen to only murder 3? What if he'd chosen to rip from their lives only 3 other human beings? These 3 human beings. Gordon Cowden at the theater with 2 of his daughters watching this movie. Gordon Cowden after the defendant. Rebecca Wingo, mother of 2 daughters, at the movie for an adult night out. Rebecca Wingo after the defendant. Or maybe Jonathan Blunk, young father of 2. And you'll remember that Mr. Blunk died trying to protect the person he was seeing the movie with. This is that father of 2 after the defendant. If he had just chosen to stop killing after 3, and when I say chosen, I mean his gun didn't jam, it was a decision, we would still be here. And the question to be asked would be, all this that you've heard over the last week, all the words and the passion from Miss Brady, would they outweigh what happened to those 3 parents? Can anything? This is phase 2. This is not the phase where you decide, I think death is appropriate or I think life is appropriate.
Judge, I'm going to object. That's a misstatement of the law.
Members of the jury, Mr. Brauchler is making an argument, and it's okay for the lawyers to make arguments. Please remember, however, that you're bound by my instructions of law. I've told you what decisions you have to make in this phase of the proceedings, and this is part of the sentencing hearing. So, in a way, both lawyers are right. Ms. Brady is indicating that this goes to the bigger picture, but Mr. Brauchler is also right that this is not the specific question you have to decide right now. Does that make sense? And everybody's saying yes and not in their head yes. Okay, Mr. Brauchler, you may proceed.
Thank you, Your Honor. And again, don't ever take my word for what the law is, please. Read the instructions that the court gives you. And what you're going to see is that this phase is about weighing, but it's what do we weigh? You have found aggravation, and we'll revisit that at the end. And that gets weighed against mitigation. And we don't know what that is yet. You have to determine what mitigation exists based on what came out of this stand, based on the documents, the pictures, the videos. And you have to ask yourself, even now, before we talk about the aggravation, before we talk about the many other victims, is there anything or everything that you saw in the last week that could outweigh what happened to Gordon Cowden and the other 2 parents? This is what the law says. Beyond a reasonable doubt, you have to find, 1, first off, that mitigating factors exist. And then you have to find that they don't outweigh the aggravating factors that we already know exist. One of the things that you can consider is mercy, but not mercy for anyone else here. It has to be mercy for him and him alone. And it can't be a mercy that you brought with you from outside. It can't be a mercy based on something that you've read outside or thought of. It has to be a mercy based upon the evidence that's presented in this courtroom.
Judge, I'm going to object.
This is right out of the instruction. This is what mercy must be based upon. It must be based upon the evidence that you heard in this courtroom. Now, sympathy. There's a lot of sympathy that was brought forward from right here, my gosh, over the last 2 days. And Mr. and Mrs. Holmes brought it with them. And it is right to feel sympathy for the parents of a mass murderer. It is right to feel sympathy for people that have to come here and talk about their son in a way that they think will encourage you to spare his life. It is impossible to imagine what they are going through. And you could hear the pain in their voices. You could see it in their faces. All of that is true. And it is right that you feel it. But where it cannot play a role is in this phase. It cannot form the basis for you to weigh the mitigators against the aggravators.
Judge, I'm going to object. That's a misstatement of the law.
Overruled.
If you feel sympathy that you want to bring into these deliberations, it must be sympathy for him, not for them. Feel it. Even talk about it, but it can't be part of this process. And we saw a lot of pictures and a lot of videos, the kinds of pictures and videos that most people have of their kids. We heard from friends, we heard from family, we heard from teachers. These are all the things that are normal for a child, because the truth is, nobody's born a mass murderer. That happens later. There are decisions and choices and ramifications that take place. Nobody's born a mass murderer. How many videos of him 8 years and younger, or pictures of him with his family, would it take to outweigh that horror? Kids change. Anyone that has been a kid or had a kid knows that how someone is at 6 or 7 is not how they are at 16, 17, 24. People change with or without anything else going on in terms of mental illness. That can't be it. We heard a lot of people from middle school, high school, and college. And what was remarkable about all of them is the consistency in the way they describe this guy. He is unchanged, virtually, from age 11. And you heard from the graduate students and the professors and everyone else that testified from CU in the guilt phase. He's unchanged. Nobody sees any difference in this guy. What if he'd have chosen to stop murdering at 4? We know from Dr. Hanlon, the defense's handpicked expert, that that's enough to qualify you as a mass murderer, maybe the junior level of mass murder. What if he'd have stopped murdering at 4, and he stopped with Alex Sullivan? You'll remember Alex. He was 27. It was his birthday. He was in the row with all of his other friends from Red Robin, and my God, so many turned out for him. That was before the defendant. This is him after. What if he'd have stopped murdering at 4? Would the videos and the pictures and the eloquent statements, the passion, would it have outweighed them? You're going to get instruction number 4 here. It's the one that you heard the judge read for about 3 hours.
Judge, I'm going to object.
Overruled.
This one is the longest instruction you'll have ever seen in this case. And what is important to note about it is the defense theory of mitigation. You don't have to treat it as a fact. You don't even have to consider these to be mitigation.
Judge,
But
I'm going to object. Can we approach?
Yes.
read the instruction where it tells you that you're not required to consider this mitigation. This is really almost like an entirely second closing statement that they get. That's what it sounded like. That's the way it reads. One of the things that you'll note from both that instruction and the argument you just heard is no matter what you're told about, hey, this isn't about who's responsible or not, there's a lot of blame being thrown around here. There's going to be suggestions in there by Miss Brady that we should blame the drugs that he stopped taking 2 months before this happened. The drugs that no expert tells you had any impact on this crime. We're also encouraged in this instruction to blame Drs. Fenton and Feinstein, even though no experts came to say they made a single mistake, but they're to be blamed for making a decision based on the information he withheld from them. But that's not what this is about. The biggest part of this, as you've heard, is the mental illness. But that's not enough. What our law could have said, as we talked about in the guilt phase, was serious mental illness means you can't be held accountable for your conduct. But we saw that that wasn't the case. in this phase, what the law could say is if you have a mental illness, even a serious mental illness, you are not eligible for death. Or that mitigator trumps all aggravators. But guess what? It doesn't. In fact, in the law that the court provides you, the statutory mitigators, mental illness isn't even in there. It talks about capacity. Is mental illness going to be a shield here to protect someone who we will see had the ability to make 1,000,000 decisions and act completely rationally in every other aspect of his life? Is this mental illness a shield to treat him differently? And let's acknowledge something here. Nobody in their right mind could plan the massacre of a theater full of human beings, and we should take comfort in that. But not having the same brain that we have does not protect you from the ramifications of those decisions. And that's what they're telling you.
Objection, Your Honor, that misstates what I said.
Overruled. Folks, I remind you this is argument. All right, you may proceed.
He's wrong, because mental illness is everything. I'm the biological mother, she's the surrogate. They took him away from me, and they adopted because they know they had mental illness. Tell you, all of my family's full of FBI. He's got violence in his blood. We need to know. Don't kill him. Don't kill him. It's not his fault. I found my work.
All right, please be seated, everyone. Mr. Brauchler, you may proceed.
Thank you, Your Honor. What the instruction tells you for statutory mitigation is the issue is not mental illness. The issue is the capacity to appreciate the wrongfulness of someone's conduct, and it's not just impacted or affected or even impaired. The law says you have to find that it's significantly impaired. Same thing with the other component of this. It's not enough that he has some impairment or some concern with the capacity to conform his conduct to the requirements of the law. It has to be significantly impaired. And what we're going to see is it's not there. We've heard a lot about the diagnosis again. Schizophreniform, schizoaffective, schizophrenia. We've heard a lot of words, and yet none of those words dictate the outcome of this case. And we know about the spectrum. Can I have a moment, Your Honor?
Yes, you can.
Thank you, Your Honor.
Go ahead.
What we've heard from both state-appointed experts is that the diagnosis isn't what's important. The diagnosis isn't the mitigator. It's whether or not it impacts his function. It's whether or not it impacts his capacity. And what we've heard is he has a psychosis. But remember what Dr. Metzner said? The reason he has a psychosis, we've concluded that, is because he has a delusion. And the reason we say he has a delusion, Dr. Metzner says, is because he wants to increase how much he values himself by killing others. And it's because he has that belief that he is called psychotic. And it is because he has that belief that he qualifies for all the other spectrum disorder potential diagnoses. Because of that belief. And the issue is, does that belief provide a mitigator? And does that belief overwhelm his ability to make decisions? Is it remember delusion was supposed to be this false fixed belief? It can't be proven false for him because he believes it. He believes he's worth more now than he was before. It can't be proven false to him. Is it fixed? Do you remember how he described it to Dr. Metzner? He said, well, it's based on the number of people killed, their own perceptions of what life is worth. It's very subjective. And your contribution to society. Children are worth more than other people, he says, because they have the rest of their life to live. But he talks to Dr. Reed and says, nope, it's points. You could say a millionaire was more important than a homeless person, but I just attribute it to an intrinsic value of this person is worth 1. Now, I get it. He has passed every single test they can provide him to test malingering on that test. I can't tell you anything different than that, but you know this. This guy right here cannot tell the same story twice to any of these mental health providers about what drives him to kill. He gives a different version of that. He gives a different version of shadows, of other hallucinations. Whatever mental illness he has, it doesn't keep him from changing his story. What they all agree upon, though, is this. That delusion, that belief system, that's his motive. And Dr. Metzner says, but for him wanting to kill people, he would not have killed people. Agreed. Dr. Reed says, yeah, that's true, but the rest of the transcript, the rest of the testimony, his report says, but that's true of if he didn't come to Colorado. This might not have happened then. Had he not broken up with his girlfriend, but for that, it might not have happened. So the issue is, where can we find what drove this guy before July 20th, 2012? The G-chat. Remember that? That's him unplugged. That's him talking intimately, one-on-one, to the woman that he loves. And how about the notebook? The notebook was written in anticipation of something, and it wasn't Dr. Fenton using it to help others. Will you visit me in prison? And there's only one way to get there, and that's through this. When he writes that notebook, his anticipation isn't it's going to be kept secret by Dr. Fenton. He knows it will go somewhere else. This is his way of describing himself going into this horror. And he talks about human capital. Capacity to appreciate wrongfulness is significantly impaired. Remember the G-chats? Of course he knows it's wrong. There's no impairment there. Taking a life will prevent a person from having their purpose. You'll prevent them from their purpose if you take away their life. Gargi comes back and says, it feels like it's destruction. You're not gaining anything from this. And does he respond and say, no, I get, no. He says, I don't believe there's absolute good or evil. He has the ability to choose. He says in that chat on March 25th, my outlook on destroying my life, not taking in human capital, not increasing my value, on destroying life is plan B. He picks plan B. He doesn't mention anything about this to Roth, to Fenton, to Feinstein, nor to Woodcock. He has the ability, according to Dr. Metzner and Dr. Reed, to make choices. He's able to make decisions. So it's not enough to think he can improve himself to himself by killing people. It doesn't keep him from making the decision not to kill. No one has told you he had to do it in this phase. What if he'd have stopped killing at 5? What if he had stopped murdering with John Larimer? Do you remember John? John Larimer, and by the way, I screwed up on those pictures. That's Alex Sullivan, and I apologize. Forgive me for that. John Larimer is our Navy guy who was, his friends attempted to drag him to safety. Do you remember that? And had to abandon him because he came back in. This is John Larimer after the defendant. Dr. Metzner and Dr. Reed say whatever's going on with him, with mental illness, it didn't impact his ability to function. You have to determine if he was able to conform his conduct to the requirements of the law. And if they weren't, was it because he was significantly impaired? Look at what he's doing at or about the time leading up to all of these conversations that he's having, all of his planning. He files his taxes, both in Colorado and California. He tells mom about it. He tells his dad he claimed himself as a dependent. He says in his notebook that when he's seeing Drs. Fenton and Drs. Feinstein, he's deliberately trying to deflect incriminating questions. And by the way, that's the only use we get to have for these statements in this notebook, is to rebut that mitigation, is to say that is not mitigation. His G-chat, March 25th. The next day is 3 days later is March 28th, and he's emailing his dad about his retirement, about putting $4,500 into his Roth IRA. Is that impairment of capacity? Is that significant impairment of capacity? Later on, he petitions for in-state tuition. You've got the voluminous emails All of the assignments he was able to do well and on time. All of the detailed planning, the purchases. He sends an application for unemployment benefits on June 16th. Where is the impairment? Where is the suggestion that this guy has left the tracks and has no ability to make decisions? July 8th, he still has the ability to mislead Hillary Allen. I still have a couple months left on my lease. 11 days later, he'll be planting bombs in his apartment. This is someone who has the capacity to make decisions and choices. Remember the officer from Winter Park? We covered this in the closing on the guilt phase. To conform his conduct to the law, when he's pulled over, he doesn't want anyone seeing in his car, so he goes and he gets window tinting on the 11th and installs it after checking online what the law is on window tinting. Does that sound psychotic? Does that sound like someone who doesn't have a grasp of reality or the capacity to conform their conduct to the law? He's anticipating the law intervening in his massacre. That's why he buys the Roadstars the day before his prelims and puts them in the front of his seat in case he had to get away in a pursuit, not from the moviegoers, but from the police he was sure would come after him. He's got money in his pocket. He takes Vicodin because he thinks the law will want to do, bless you, will want to do something to hurt him after this. Same thing with the first aid dressing. Capacity to appreciate wrongfulness significantly impaired. How about more of the G-chats? What I feel like doing is evil, so I can't do that. What is so evil? Killing people, of course. Killing people's too much effort. She reminds him, the law says not to do it, you'll get locked up. And then he comes back with a rationalization. I'd lose the rest of my life. There's no way to do it and not get caught. And that's why you kill many people, because he's able to weigh it. Yep, I'll go to prison. That's why I'm going to get a lot out the door. And that's exactly what he does here. You wait to kill until the end of your life, there's nothing to lose. He says, despite knowing death is false in the notebook that he sends off before going to do this massacre. He talks about the cruel twists of fate to the unkind. This guy knows what he's doing is wrong. This guy knows what he's doing is illegal. And then there's that interesting thing towards the end where he writes, research firearms laws and mental illness. Why would he need to do that? Is that significant impairment of his capacity? That's the opposite of significant impairment. And you remember what Dr. Metzner said? That delusion, that psychosis, that motive that he had, it was selfish. There's no other word for it. It was all about him from start to stop. What if he'd have stopped killing at 6? What if he'd have stopped murdering at Jesse Childress, our other service member? Remember the one that was magnanimous and bought all the tickets for his friends. That's Jesse Childress after the defendant. That's halfway, folks. What have you seen or heard here in the last week? How many videos of dogs and surfing and the cute kid at Christmas would you see to outweigh 6 people ripped out of their lives in that fashion? Choices. He tells us in the notebook, the real me, namely the thinking me, does things not because I'm programmed to, but because I choose to. Those are the words he chose to write. You've heard in one of the non-statutory mitigators in the defense instruction, they say mental illness was the cause of this, that it was but for. But I want you to think about the other reasons this occurred, the bigger reasons. Academic rejection. You remember that? On February 23rd, he writes to his girlfriend, the professor got pissed, Mark Delacqua. He tells his dad a week later, finished up my second lab, professor got peeved, told me not to join his lab. Months later, to Hillary Allen, sick of Delacqua yet? He would always linger way too long. He got pissed at me. 6 weeks, and he is perseverating on the fact that he was rejected academically. He continues to disparage Professor Delacqua to this future love interest. He just goes off and quotes random shit. Now, what if he'd have stopped killing at 7? What if he'd have stopped killing with Alexander Teves, who had just gotten his master's degree? Do you remember? In social work? Goodness. I don't have that picture, but you'll remember Alexander Teves was shot mercilessly in the head. And this is what he looked like before the defendant. Thank you. Mental illness was the cause. But for, how about the romantic rejection? He writes in his notebook that he knows is going out the door before the massacre. The last battle I lost, I finally succumbed to, was falling in love. He talks to his dad about Gargi breaking up with him. It hasn't been the best of times. He tells his mom the Gargi situation is complex, complete disassociation. He doesn't know what to do with himself. In the notebook, he tells us before the massacre, with love gone, my motivation was directed to, wait for it, human capital, increasing his self-worth, motivations directed to hate. What if he'd have stopped killing after 8? What if he'd have stopped killing the young lovers, the fiancés in the theater, with this picture taken moments before he separated them forever? Would all the things you've heard in the week leading up to this, would they outweigh that? But for hatred. His friend, Ben Garcia, closest friend in grad school, tells you he was angry at the world. We know from his notebook, he says, if I reveal to Fenton and Feinstein my plan, not only will my normal life be gone, but my ideal enactment on not self-actualization, not self-improvement, not self-worth, hatred will be foiled. Embrace the hatred, my long-standing hatred of mankind. He writes down love and hate, hatred unchecked, his primary drive, reversion to hatred of mankind, the long-standing hatred of mankind. Remember, love gone, motivation directed to hate, embrace the hatred. He tells William Reed, he asks him, what did the shootings have to do, if anything, with hating people? And by the way, these are the statements he makes after he's been charged with murder. These are the statements he makes after he's been told there will be a death penalty on the table. And he says, just that they make me anxious, and because they make me anxious, I hate them. What does he tell Woodcock 4 days after he's arrested for this massacre? I hate everybody. What if he'd stopped killing after Matthew McQuinn? Where would we be? Would we say all the things that we heard, all the explanations, all the passion, that outweighed them? This is what he looked like before. Do you remember? This is what he looked like after the defendant. That's Matt McQuinn, with the woman he'd hoped to get engaged to that night. But for the desire to kill, he decided to dedicate his life to killing others. When? After he met with Mel Lipsey in his early teens. He tells us he's had an obsession to kill, not since sertraline, not since high school, since I was a kid. Mass murder at the movies, his first obsession since more than 10 years ago. The last sentence of his notebook, the last sentence, is life shouldn't exist. Hatred, not self-worth. And he wants to be remembered. No matter what he tells Dr. Reed in the months before this trial begins, we know what he did. We know for his profile, he lets people know, these women that may visit it, will you visit me in prison? And that precedes the notebook. And here's what I want you to look at. If he's driven by self-actualization, by increasing his self-worth, why does he do this analysis of why not an airport? Too much of a terrorist history. Terrorism isn't the message. If he is consumed by this delusion to increase his self-worth, why, oh why, in the last things he writes before he carries out this massacre, does he care about how people will interpret it? Because that's part of it. He goes on to criticize people. Most fools are going to misinterpret why I did this. The selfies. He may not have sent them to the New York Times, but we know he took them for the New York Times. Those black contact lenses just showed up. He tells Dr. Metzner, they'd look good to whoever viewed them. He's anticipating people getting these pictures that he never sent to the Times. Took selfies, had pretty specifically, you want to be remembered? Right. I don't think people are going to remember me for any other reason. It's unusual to have dyed hair like that, he agrees. And he says, it's because it's more likely to be you'll remember something unusual than something mundane. Is it important to be remembered? He tells William Reed in the part of the clip they didn't show you, I'd say yes. There's that picture, that ominous picture that he took, that he posed for, that he wants to post to the New York Times, but he doesn't. On the last page of his notebook, he directs people to Squarespace. One of the things that you're told to consider is his cooperation with law enforcement as a mitigator. Remember that the evidence was from them that, it would have never really worked. He didn't really think it was going to work. So why cooperate? Because he'd set out to accomplish something to make him value himself more and for notoriety, and that was done. He didn't need the apartment anymore. It didn't cost him anything to cooperate. It wasn't for some noble purpose. He doesn't have it in him. Will you visit me in prison? And it looks like the answer is yes. This is why he did this. Do you see the pictures of Zuby up there? The pictures mom and dad gave him? No. This is his interest. Maybe he could have stopped killing after 10. What if he'd have stopped murdering after 10 and we'd have had Michaela Medic, the unfortunate one who moved to the back. Do you remember that? Saw 2 seats open there. A friend and she went back there, and it turned out to be the unluckiest, unfortunate, cruelest decision she could have made. That's how she's left by him after she meets him. Lying in wait from an ambush. You know that he created this kill box, this one right here. Can't get out of here. And any exits he tried to close down. He brought 700 rounds. He fired steel penetrator rounds. He surprises the people that he wants to kill. He traps the people that he wants to kill. Lying in wait. To do it, he needed patience. This guy who was reacting only to this bizarre delusion that was driving him in all his decisions was able to plan for 3 months this massacre, and at the moment it was going to take place, he could sit still, sit calm, watch his victims take their seats. There was no haste. He uses the cell phone ruse to make sure he doesn't trouble them and encourage them to see what's going on. He keeps the door open. And then he begins this especially heinous, cruel, and depraved manner that you found. Conscienceless, pitiless, unnecessarily torturous. How about what if he'd have stopped killing after Jessica Gowie? Now, we don't have a picture of Jessica in the theater. They tried to save her. But this is her before the defendant. What if he'd have stopped killing here? Would anything that you have seen outweighed 11 dead? Conscienceless and pitiless. He waits in the concession area near theater number 9. Think about the patience. Think about the cold-bloodedness. He is standing there surrounded by people that he knows he is going to try to murder very shortly as they sit in their seats around him using this kind of a weapon, a shotgun. Unnecessarily torturous. He pins them in with tear gas to rob them of the ability to breathe, to flee. Extreme discomfort, and it puts them in fear of stuff other than being shot. He killed his victims in a crowded movie theater, trapped by design in the darkness. Some victims unable to flee, surrounded by screams and pain and anguish, and if you close your eyes, you can picture it all. And death. There's nothing they could do about it, and he saw to that. At the moments of their deaths, his victims would not only be in fear for their lives, but as we've seen from some of the others who tried to protect people on their way to death, they'd be scared for their friends' lives and their families' lives, and he knew it. And remember, as you go back and analyze his decisions, there's not a single throwaway decision he made. There's not one unexplained purchase, not one unexplained web search. Every decision he makes is purposeful and rational towards an outrageously evil goal. Grave risk of death, He used this weapon with those 700 rounds, brought enough ammo to kill everyone almost twice. Steel penetrator rounds in this 100-round magazine. Remember the scatter shot spree he takes on here? Doesn't care where it goes. And these are his victims. I can't linger on these for more than a second or less. There are so many. This is the grave risk of death he visited on them, because these are the people he wanted dead.
5 minutes, counsel.
Thank you, ma'am. Some of these you'll remember. You remember Dion Rossborough walking up here showing you how he patrolled the front and walked up to him and looked him in the face before he pulled the trigger. Grave risk of death. How many surfing movies, how many tears from family members and teachers can outweigh this? He didn't stop killing after 11, though. There was one more. It was our 6-year-old. And you have the picture of her back there, and I told you I'd never make you look at it again. This is how he finished up. 4 bullets into this one. Is what you've heard here over the last week, is the passion, the description of the mental illness, does that outweigh all that? Does that get him life? You hesitate on this in your weighing process, take a moment and go back and watch the crime scene video. Bring yourself back to the aftermath of the defendant's rational, deliberate decision-making before you make that decision. He knew what he was doing was wrong. He weighed his options. He made his choices and his decisions. And now you must weigh and make yours. Beyond a reasonable doubt, mitigating factors that exist, if you find they exist, don't outweigh the aggravating factors. Not for this phase. On July 20th, 2012, with a long-standing hatred of mankind in his heart, an obsession to kill, and the end of a romantic relationship, the first of its kind for him, the end of a career, the one he dreamt of since he was a kid, according to his mom, he made a decision to massacre, and he did. 12 dead from the community. Can anything outweigh that?